The day Matilda Finley's roof caved in was the same day she decided she would rather sleep under open sky than ask a single soul in Caldwell, Kansas for so much as a spare nail. It was the autumn of 1878, and the wind that swept across the prairie that October carried the particular cruelty of a season turning hard and fast. The collapse had not been dramatic, no thunderclap, no great splitting sound, just a slow groan from the northeastern corner of the modest homestead. She had worked alone since her husband Robert had gone and gotten himself killed in a cattle dispute 8 months prior. The sod roof had been weakening since July, and she had patched it herself twice, climbing up there with wet mud and dried grass while her neighbors watched from the road and said nothing useful. On that Tuesday morning, the corner simply surrendered, and a section the size of a wagon bed folded inward, scattering dried grass and dark earth across her iron stove, her only table, and the quilt her mother had made her. Matilda stood in the wreckage with her hands on her hips and her jaw set so tight it ached. She was 28 years old, with brown hair she kept pinned back so severely it gave her the appearance of a woman much older, and gray eyes that people in town described as direct to the point of being unsettling. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself in a way that made most men unconsciously straighten their own backs when she walked past. She had come out to Caldwell from Ohio with Robert Finley 6 years ago, full of hope and not much else, and she had poured herself into that land with a devotion that had outlasted her marriage and, as it turned out, her husband. She was not going to ask for help. She had made herself that promise 8 months ago at Robert's burial, when the women from the Methodist Church had descended on her with their casseroles and their pitying eyes and their whispers about what a woman alone was going to do, and she had thanked them all very politely and meant none of it. She had her pride, and her pride was the one thing the Kansas wind had not yet managed to strip away from her. What she had not accounted for was Frank Fletcher. Frank Fletcher arrived in Caldwell 3 days after the roof caved in, riding a dark bay gelding named Copperhead and trailing a mule loaded with tools. He was 32 years old, lean in the way that men who worked hard were lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving, and a reputation in the surrounding counties that was equal parts admirable and complicated. He had been a cowhand for most of his 20s, working the cattle drives up from Texas along the Kisham Trail, before he had saved enough to buy himself a small parcel of land 8 miles east of Caldwell, where he now ran a modest but successful operation raising horses. He was known as a man who kept his word and kept his distance, 2 qualities that the people of Caldwell respected without ever fully warming to. He came into town for supplies on that Friday morning and heard about the Finley widow's roof at the general store, because in a town of 1,100 people, there was no such thing as private misfortune. "Shame about that woman," said Harold Pruitt behind the counter, weighing out flour with the disinterest of a man who had delivered news of tragedies alongside sugar and lamp oil for 20 years. "She won't let anybody near the place, of course. Turned away the Dawson boys yesterday. Said she had it handled." Frank loaded his supplies into his saddlebags and thought about the Finley widow, whom he had seen exactly twice. Once at the Mercantile in the spring, when she had argued successfully with Harold Pruitt over the price of seed corn, and once at the Independence Day gathering, where she had stood at the edge of the festivities with a glass of lemonade and the expression of a woman who was present purely out of a sense of civic obligation. He had not spoken to either occasion, but he had noticed her both times in the way that you notice something that does not quite fit the frame around it. He rode out of town heading east, in the direction of his own land, and passed the Finley homestead on the road. He saw her on the roof. She was up there in the thin October sunlight, wearing a canvas work apron over her dress and balancing on the intact portion of the sod structure with a concentrated focus that was frankly extraordinary to witness. She had a bucket of wet mud beside her and was applying it to the broken edge with her bare hands, working methodically, pressing and smoothing in the way of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. Frank stopped his horse at the gate. He did not call out immediately. He sat and watched for a moment, not from rudeness, but because he was trying to understand what he was looking at. The section she was patching was the minor portion of the damage. The major collapse, the part that had actually opened the roof to the sky, was a good 6 feet to her left, and the angle at which she would need to reach it, combined with the instability of the surrounding sod, meant that if she moved that direction without proper bracing, she was going to come down through the roof and land on her iron stove. "You're going to fall through," he said. She did not startle. She turned her head and looked at him with those gray eyes that he now saw up close were even more direct than he had remembered. "I appreciate the observation," she said. "I don't recall asking for one." "That's true," he said, "but you're going to fall through anyway, regardless of whether you asked." She turned back to her patching. "The sod is solid enough on this end. I'm working toward the damage gradually." "The problem," Frank said, "is that the collapse weakened the interior support beam on the left side, and the weight distribution is off. You can't see it from where you're standing, but I can see the sag from here." There was a pause. She did not stop working, but the rhythm of her movement slowed slightly, which he took as the closest thing to listening that she was willing to show. "You're Frank Fletcher," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You raise horses out on the Eastern Road." "That's right." "Then you know horses," she said, "and I'll grant you may know a thing or two about structures, but this is my roof and I am managing it." "I can see that," Frank said. "I was wondering if you might be interested in a trade." She stopped. She turned and looked at him again, and this time there was something in her expression that he could not quite read, a sharpening of attention behind the pride. "What kind of trade?" she said. This was the part he had been working out on the ride from the gate to this moment, which was admittedly not much time, but Frank Fletcher had always been a man who thought better when he had a specific problem in front of him. "I've got a mare that's been difficult to handle since she threw a shoe and spooked herself last month. I've heard you're good with horses." This was something he had heard. In fact, Harold Pruitt had mentioned it once in passing, that the Finley woman had a way with difficult animals that her husband had never matched. "I have some experience," she said carefully. "I need someone to spend time with her, get her settled back into working trust. That's a skill I don't have the patience for right now, not with the foaling season coming up. In exchange," he said, very deliberately keeping his voice even and practical, "I would come and look at your roof support beam. Just to look. And if I happen to have the materials to address the structural issue, because I have been meaning to clean out my barn and I have extra timber that is only going to rot otherwise, then that would just be good economics." The silence stretched out between them for a long moment. A crow called somewhere out over the prairie grass. The wind moved across the flat land and stirred the hem of her work apron. "You're describing a business arrangement," she said. "I am," he said. "A fair one, I think. You haven't seen my work with horses." "No," he admitted, "but I've seen you up on that roof for the past 10 minutes and you haven't made a single wrong move on the stable portion, so your instincts seem sound." Something shifted in her expression. It was not warmth, exactly, not yet, but it was a slight softening of the set of her jaw, as if she had decided to set down one particular weapon while she evaluated the situation. "I will come and look at your mare," she said, "tomorrow morning. And you may come and look at the beam. Just look." "Just look," he agreed. He touched the brim of his hat and rode on, and she turned back to her patching, and that was how it began. She came the next morning at 7, before the dew had fully dried off the grass, riding the big gray horse she called Judge because, she would explain later, he always looked disappointed in everyone around him. Frank was in the paddock when she arrived, and he watched her dismount with the economy of motion that spoke of years on horseback, tie Judge to the post by the gate, and walk toward him with the directness that he was already beginning to recognize as simply the way she moved through the world. The mare was a 3-year-old roan named Sable, standing in the far corner of the paddock with her ears flat, and her weight shifted back in that particular way that meant she was ready to move away from anything that came near her. Matilda stopped at the fence and looked at the horse for a long time without moving. "How long since she's let anyone put a hand on her?" Matilda asked. 2 weeks, Frank said. "She'll take grain from my hand if I come alone and quiet, but the moment I try to approach with any purpose, she's at the other end of the paddock." Matilda nodded slowly. She was watching the horse the way Frank had seen a few skilled horsemen watch animals, not staring directly, but taking in the whole picture, the posture and the muscle tension and the particular angle of those flattened ears. "Leave us," she said. Frank blinked. "I beg your pardon. You're standing there with purpose," she said. "I can feel it from here. She can feel it from there. Go inside or go to the barn or go wherever you go when you're not looking at her. I'll call you when I'm ready." He almost argued. He stood there for a moment with the argument right there in his chest, because this was his horse and his paddock, and he was not a man accustomed to being told to leave his own property. But she had already stopped looking at him and was looking at the mare again, and the logic of what she had said was undeniable, and so he went. He watched from the barn window, which he recognized was not technically leaving, but which he felt was a reasonable compromise. What she did in that paddock over the next hour and a half was one of the more remarkable things Frank Fletcher had ever witnessed. She moved with such patience and such indirectness that it took him a while to even understand what she was doing. She would take 2 steps toward the mare and then stop and turn slightly sideways, presenting her shoulder rather than her chest, reducing herself in posture and intention until she was simply another quiet thing in the paddock. The mare would watch her, and after a long time the mare's ears would come forward slightly, and then Matilda would take 2 more steps, and the process would repeat. By the end of the hour, the mare was allowing Matilda to stand at her shoulder with one hand resting lightly on her neck. Frank came out of the barn. "That's more than I've managed in 2 weeks, he said, keeping his voice low. Matilda did not look at him, keeping her attention on the horse. "She's not broken," she said. "She's frightened. Those are not the same thing, and the remedies are completely different." "I know that," Frank said a little stiffly. "I know you know it," she said. "I'm saying it for my own benefit. I'm reminding myself of the difference because it helps me stay patient." He did not have a response to that, which was unusual for him. She came 4 more times that week and 2 times the following week, and by the end of October, Sable would walk to the fence when she heard Matilda's horse on the road and stand with her head over the rail waiting. Frank had never seen the mare do that for anyone. On the morning of the 2nd day, true to his word, he came to look at the beam. He stood in her ruined front room with the pale light coming through the collapsed section and looked up at the damage with the focused attention he gave to any structural problem, and what he saw was worse than he had hoped. "It's not just the one beam," he said. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "How bad?" He was quiet for a moment, which she was already learning was worse than if he had simply told her directly. "The whole northeastern corner needs to come down and be rebuilt. Not patched, rebuilt." Her face did not change, but something behind it did, a very brief flicker of something that might have been fear before it was smoothed back to composure. "How long would that take?" "With proper materials and enough hands, a week, maybe less." "And your extra timber from the barn," she said, keeping her voice flat and practical. "How much of it is there?" "Enough," he said, looking at her steadily. "And I have 2 ranch hands who owe me labor, and I find myself at a natural pause in my work before the real cold sets in." "And what would this cost me in terms of additional work with your mare?" she asked. "Sable is already half settled," he said. "What you've done with her this week is worth more than the materials. The labor I'm giving you freely because I want to." He saw the wall go up immediately, saw her spine straighten and her jaw come forward. "That last part," she said, "was the wrong thing to say." "I know," he said. "Let me rephrase. I haven't repaired a sod roof in 4 years, and my ranch hands have never done it at all. The practice will be useful to us before our own winter repairs. We will benefit from the exercise." She regarded him for a long, measuring moment. "That's considerably better," she said. But I'm going to provide meals for any man who works on this property. That is not negotiable and not charity. It is the proper exchange for labor, and I will not have it any other way." "That seems entirely reasonable," he said, and he was careful to keep the warmth out of his voice because he could see that warmth, in this particular context, would be received as condescension. The work began 3 days later on a Monday, and Frank's two ranch hands, a quiet Mexican man named Esteban Ruiz and a younger man from Missouri named Billy Cord, arrived at first light with the wagon loaded with timber and tools. Matilda had been up since before dawn. She had made biscuits and ham and strong coffee, and the breakfast she laid out on the table she had moved to the outdoor area was better than anything Frank had eaten in recent memory. He noticed that she did not sit and watch them work. She worked alongside them. She could not handle the heaviest timbers, but she could and did handle everything else, handing up tools, mixing mortar, preparing the sod blocks with a shovel alongside Esteban, who did not speak much English but communicated with Matilda through a combination of gestures and expressions that seemed to work perfectly well. By the second day, Esteban was teaching her words in Spanish that she was writing down in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and the two of them carried on what appeared to be a running conversation in a mix of two languages that Frank found himself watching with something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. "She working hard," Billy said to Frank on the second afternoon, watching Matilda carry a bucket of wet clay to the far side of the structure. "She is," Frank said. "My mama worked like that after my daddy left," Billy said. "Worked herself half to death proving she didn't need nobody." He paused. "Didn't end well for mama." "Mrs. Finley is not your mother," Frank said, more sharply than he intended. Billy gave him a sideways look that was much older than his 23 years. "No, sir," he said pleasantly, and returned to his work. On the third evening, when the structural beam was in and the new corner was taking shape, Frank stayed after Billy and Esteban had ridden back toward the ranch. He stayed because his horse had thrown a loose shoe, and he needed to attend to it before riding home, which was true, and also because the light was good and the evening air was warm for October, and he was not ready to leave, which was a separate truth that he filed away without examining it too closely. Matilda brought 2 cups of coffee out to the front step and set one on the low rail near where he was working on Copperhead's shoe. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said, sitting down on the step with her own cup. "That's why I did." He looked at her for a moment, understanding the distinction she was drawing, and then turned back to the horse. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the kind that requires trust to build and trust requires time, and the fact that this silence already existed between them after only a few days seemed significant to Frank in a way he could not quite articulate. "Your husband," he said, and then stopped, because he had not planned to say that and was not sure where he was going. She was quiet for a moment. "Robert," she said. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "It's fine," she said. "He was a good man who made a bad decision on a bad day, and the cattle dispute that killed him was as pointless as most violence is. I've made my peace with it." She paused. "Or I'm making my peace with it. The process is ongoing." "That's honest," he said. "I find honesty considerably less exhausting than the alternative," she said. "Were you ever married?" "No," he said. "Why not?" she asked in the direct way that he was coming to expect from her, not provocative, just genuinely curious. He thought about it. "I was on the trail drives until I was 26, he said. "Then I was building the ranch. There wasn't," he paused. "There wasn't space for it, I suppose. Not that I made space for it." "That's honest," she said, echoing his own words back to him with a slight smile that he caught out of the corner of his eye. He smiled too, facing the horse, and Copperhead turned his head and gave him a look of mild disdain. "Your horse," Matilda said, "seems very tolerant of you." "He is," Frank said, "which is more than most people manage." "You're not that difficult," she said, and then seemed to realize she had said something more personal than she intended because she looked down at her coffee cup. "What I mean is, you've been straightforward in your dealings, which is not always the case." "No," Frank agreed, "it's not." The roof was finished on Friday of that week, and it was solid and right and better than it had been before the collapse. Matilda stood in her repaired front room and looked up at the new timber and the fresh sod, and her hands were clasped in front of her in a gesture that Frank recognized as her version of relief. "It's good work," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I want to be clear," she said, turning to face him with that direct gray gaze, "that I understand what you did here. I'm not naive about what the arrangement was." "It was a fair trade," he said simply. "You called it something else," she said. "But I let you." A beat of silence. "Because what you called it allowed me to keep something I couldn't afford to lose." He understood she was talking about her pride, and he nodded slowly. "For what it's worth," he said, "I wasn't trying to take anything from you. I needed to find the door that was actually open." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read, and then said, "Come to supper on Sunday, you and your men. I will cook a proper meal as a proper closing of this particular arrangement." "We'll be here," he said. He rode home in the late afternoon light with the sense of a man who has been given something he did not know he was missing. The Sunday supper was not the closing of anything, as it turned out. It was, instead, the beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name. Matilda cooked a meal that silenced Billy Cord for a full 20 minutes, which Frank later told her was a feat no one had accomplished in the 2 years the boy had worked for him. There was roast pork and corn and dried apple pie and fresh bread, and she moved around the outdoor table with the ease of a woman who had been feeding people all her life. Esteban ate 3 portions of everything and thanked her in Spanish, and she answered him in the words she had been practicing, and he laughed with what appeared to be genuine delight. After the meal, Billy and Esteban rode back, and Frank lingered in the way he had been lingering all week without meaning to. "You could go," she said, not unkindly, clearing the tin plates from the table. "I could," he said. He was leaning against the gate-post and not moving. "But you're not going to." "I thought I'd see if you needed anything done before dark," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "My woodpile needs splitting," she said. "The axe is behind the house." He split wood for an hour while she moved around inside doing the things that needed doing at the end of a day, and the rhythm of the axe and the smell of the split wood, and the sound of her moving around behind the newly repaired walls created something that felt remarkably like domesticity. And Frank Fletcher, who had lived alone for 32 years and arranged things that way deliberately, found that he did not want to stop. He came back Tuesday. He came back Thursday. He told himself both times that he was checking on the roof, which needed no checking. Matilda did not point this out. She made coffee and they talked, and the talking was the kind that moves quickly from surface to depth without the usual lengthy journey, the kind that happens between people who are, at their core, similarly organized. She told him about Ohio, about the farm her father had run with the loving incompetence of a man who preferred philosophy to practicality, about her mother who had been the actual engine of the family, and who had made that quilt now rescued from the collapsed room and repaired with careful hands. She told him about coming west with Robert, about the first winter that had nearly broken them both, about the spring that had saved them, and the slow building of something that had been, if not grand, then genuine. He told her about the cattle drives, about the long months of dust and heat, and the particular loneliness of the open trail that was simultaneously the loneliest and the most alive he had ever felt. He told her about the horse ranch, about the satisfaction of working with animals whose trust you had to earn properly, about the way a good horse knew you better than you knew yourself. "That's why you noticed what I was doing with Sable," she said one evening. "You know what earned trust looks like." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight of her repaired home and said, "I do." And the statement covered more than horses, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. November came in cold and determined. The prairie grass turned the color of old copper, and the first frosts left their marks in the mornings. Frank rode over on the second Tuesday of November with something in his saddlebag that he did not immediately produce, stopping instead to admire the way the repaired roof was sitting against the sky. "It's holding," she said, following his gaze from the doorway. "It's holding," he agreed. She had flour on her apron, which meant she was baking, which meant the house smelled the way a house is supposed to smell in November, and he stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and said, "I brought something." She raised her eyebrows. He reached into the saddlebag and produced a small bundle wrapped in burlap, which she took with narrowed eyes and unwrapped to reveal a tin of good quality lamp oil, and beneath that, a small book, a collection of stories by Bret Harte that she did not have and that Frank had found at the dry goods store when he had been there for entirely other purposes. "The lamp oil is practical," she said. "The book is not." "The book is also practical," he said. "Long evenings coming." She looked down at it with her hands wrapped around it. "Frank," she said, and something in his name and her voice made him very still. "I'm not doing charity," he said. He stopped. He put his hat back on and took it off again. "I don't have a good business arrangement to offer you for that particular item," he said. "I bought it because I thought you would like it and because I wanted to give you something. And I understand if that is too much and I'm not asking anything in return." She was quiet for a long time, looking at the book. A hawk circled somewhere over the near field. "I'm going to make dinner," she said finally, "and you're going to stay and eat it." "That seems fair," he said, and she went inside, and that was the night things changed between them, though they did not acknowledge it with any dramatic declaration. It changed in the way that real things change, not with a thunderclap, but with a slow tilting, like a ship finding its true heading. Over the dinner table she told him, with a candor that surprised them both, that she had been frightened for most of the past year. Not of the land or the work or the winter, but of the way that people looked at her as a widow, as either a burden or a resource, as something to be handled or acquired, never simply as herself. She said it plainly, in the way that she said most things, but the plainness did not disguise the rawness underneath it. "I look at you," Frank said carefully, "as the woman who put my spooked horse back together in 8 days and who fixed her own roof before she would ask for a hand, and who argued Harold Prewitt down to the fair price on seed corn and won." He paused. "That's who I see." She set her fork down very precisely beside her plate. "That is," she said, in a voice that was steady but barely, "a very good answer." He walked home that night. He had come on foot for once, it being a fine enough evening, with the sense of a man who has been standing at the edge of something large and has finally looked down and decided that the depth is not a reason to step back. He came back on Thursday and on Saturday. And on Saturday evening he helped her bring in the last of her winter store from the cellar and stack it against the new wall. And when they finished, they stood in the reorganized room with the lamp burning and the November wind outside and the comfortable tiredness of shared work between them. And he reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had come loose from her severe pin back behind her ear, very gently, as if the gesture were a question. She did not move away. She looked up at him with those gray eyes that had lost their wariness somewhere in the past weeks, replaced by something more open and more frightening in the best possible way. "I'm not easy," she said. "You should know that clearly. I have opinions about most things and I don't release them without reason, and I have been known to argue with men twice my size over matters I consider important." "I know," he said, "and I will not be managed," she said, "or handled, or helped in ways that are actually control wearing a different coat." "I know that too," he said. "Then what are you doing?" she asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine question. He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "I think I'm standing in your front room at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night hoping you'll let me come back Sunday," he said. "And the Sunday after that and the one after that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You may come on Sunday." He came on Sunday. December arrived, and with it the particular quality of winter on the Kansas plains, not the dramatic snowstorms of the East, but a deep, pervasive cold that settled into the land like a guest who meant to stay through spring. The prairie under its thin coat of snow was a vast and silent country, and in the evenings the sky above it was extraordinary stars so bright and numerous that they seemed almost aggressive in their quantity, as if the sky were compensating for the starkness of the land beneath. Frank and Matilda had, by December, settled into a pattern that everyone in Caldwell could observe, and that neither of them had formally declared. He rode over 4 days out of 7. She came to the ranch once a week to continue her work with Sable, who was now a fully settled and cooperative mare who would come to Matilda's voice from 100 yards away. Billy Cord had begun, with the casualness of a young man trying to seem uninvested in what he was doing, to ensure that the good coffee was made when Matilda was expected, and Esteban brought her a gift of dried peppers one day with a gravity that suggested it was a significant offering. The town had opinions about the arrangement, because small towns always do. Martha Dawson, who ran the Women's Charity Committee at the Methodist Church, stopped Matilda outside the general store one December morning and said, with the well-intentioned invasiveness of a woman who genuinely believed her observations were helpful, "I hear Frank Fletcher is spending considerable time at your place, Matilda. People are talking." Matilda looked at her with the expression she reserved for situations that required restraint. "People talk about everything in this town, Martha. They talked about my roof falling in before it was cold." "I only mean," Martha said, lowering her voice, "that it might not look entirely proper for a widow woman to be what?" Matilda said, and her voice was very quiet now, which was somehow more effective than if it had been loud. "Working, having company at supper, conducting a business arrangement with a neighbor that has benefited both parties. Or are you suggesting that I should confine myself to my property and see no one and accept no friendship from any quarter because my husband died and I am therefore supposed to become a sort of living monument to grief?" Martha opened her mouth and closed it again. "I have respected every convention that deserves respect," Matilda said. "I will not respect the ones that don't. Good morning, Martha." She walked into the general store, and Harold Prewitt, who had heard every word through the open door, said nothing, but allowed himself a small private smile at the flour barrel. Frank heard about the exchange that afternoon, because Billy had been at the feed store next door and had come home with the full account, which he delivered with the breathless enthusiasm of someone reporting a frontier victory. "She said it right to her face," Billy reported. "Said she wouldn't respect conventions that don't deserve respect." "She's right," Frank said, and went back to the fence he was mending. "You ought to marry her," Billy said. Frank's fence mending continued without interruption. "Is that so? I'm just saying, the way she talks, the way she works, the way you are when she's around versus the way you are when she's not around." Billy paused. "It's noticeable is all." "Go mend the north pasture fence," Frank said. "Yes, sir," Billy said, not remotely chastened. The thought, which Frank had been having in various forms since approximately the 3rd day of working on Matilda's roof, was not news to him. He had simply been going carefully with it, the way you go carefully with any question whose answer matters very much. He knew what he wanted. He was less certain about timing and approach, because Matilda Finley was a woman who required a very specific kind of approach. Not grand gestures, not romantic performances, but honesty and directness, and a complete absence of anything that could be mistaken for pity or management. He thought about it through December. He thought about it on the evenings when they sat across the table from each other in her repaired house and read. She had made her way through the Bret Harte collection, and was now on a volume of history that she argued with aloud in the margins. And the lamp burned between them, and the winter outside was held back by 4 solid walls that he had helped make solid, and that she had fought to keep. He thought about it when he watched her with the horses, that extraordinary patience and attentiveness, and the way she could read an animal's state of mind with the same sensitivity she turned on people. He thought about it when she laughed, which she did not do constantly, but when she did it was whole and real, and directed at things that were genuinely funny rather than performed for anyone's comfort. On the evening of December 18th, he came to her house with no specific plan and found her outside in the cold, standing at the fence of her small paddock where she kept judge, and a second horse she'd acquired in the fall, looking out over the frozen prairie with an expression he had not seen on her before. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at her for a moment. The sun was going down in the west in the particular extravagance of a winter prairie sunset, orange and deep red and a long band of purple along the horizon, and she was standing with her arms folded and her breath coming out in small clouds and her face in profile against that sky. He got down and tied his horse and walked to where she was standing. "What's wrong?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "I was just thinking about next year." "What about it?" She turned and looked at him. "I've been doing the accounts," she said. "The land produces enough to sustain the homestead, but barely." Robert had plans to expand the operation to plant an additional field south of the creek and bring in cattle to graze the back pasture. But the startup cost for cattle is, she paused. "It's beyond what I can manage alone." He leaned on the fence rail beside her, looking out at the sunset. "What would you need for the south field?" "A proper plow. The one I have is Robert's old one-bottom plow and the blade is worn. And seed, of course." She paused. "I'm not asking you," she added quickly. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm just thinking out loud." "I know that too," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have a two-bottom plow that I don't use for most of the season," he said. "It sits in the barn from April through October. You could use it in the spring if you want." She turned her head and looked at him sideways. "That's the arrangement again," she said. "What do I give you for the use of the plow?" He looked at her. The sunset was doing remarkable things to the color of the air between them. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about a different kind of arrangement." She was very still. "A permanent one," he said. He turned from the sunset to face her fully. "I have a ranch that runs well, but would run better with a partner who knows horses and land the way you do. You have a homestead that is sound and productive and would be more so with a partner who has the resources to help it reach what it should be. Those are practical facts." He paused. "They are not, however, the reason I'm standing here." "Tell me the reason you're standing here," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "Because I have spent the last 2 months trying to find excuses to be in your company and running out of them. And because I know the sound of you moving around on the other side of a wall better than I know most people's faces. And because you argue with books in the margins and you teach spooked horses patience by being patient yourself. And you told Martha Dawson to her face what needed to be said. And because—" He stopped. He looked at her directly, the way she had always looked at him. "Because I love you, Matilda, and I want to ask you to marry me, and I want you to understand that I am asking you as yourself. Not as a widow who needs help, not as an arrangement, as yourself." The silence that followed was the longest of Frank Fletcher's life. She turned back to the sunset for a moment and he could see her throat move as she swallowed. "You called the roof a business arrangement," she said. "I did. And the plow is a business arrangement." "No," he said. "I said I was thinking of a different kind. I'm done with arrangements that are actually something else. I'm done calling things by names that make them easier to accept." He paused. "This is me asking you directly, with nothing called anything other than what it is." She turned to him again. In the fading light, her eyes were the color of winter water, deep and clear and not cold. "I am not easy," she reminded him. "I know," he said. "I am very aware of that fact. And I will not be a junior partner in anything, including a marriage. My land is mine, and my opinion is mine, and my work is mine." "I wouldn't want a junior partner," he said. "I'd want an equal one. I'd want you." She was quiet for one more long moment, and he waited with the patience he had learned, at least in part, from watching her. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Frank." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that clouded in the cold air, and reached out and took both her hands in his, which were warm despite the temperature, which he would remember for the rest of his life. They were married in February of 1879, in the Caldwell Methodist Church, in a ceremony that was practical and honest, and exactly like both of them. Matilda wore a dress of deep blue that she had made herself, because she did not see any reason to be married in something she could not also wear on other occasions of significance. And Frank wore his best coat and the good boots he had bought in Wichita 2 years before, and had been saving for something worthy of them. Esteban Ruiz and Billy Cord stood at the side of the church with faces of such transparent happiness that Martha Dawson, sitting 3 rows back, was moved in spite of herself. The minister, a weathered man named Reverend Caldwell, who had been conducting ceremonies on the Kansas frontier for 20 years, and had long since stopped expecting people to conform to Eastern notions of ceremony, pronounced them husband and wife with a warmth that was genuine and a brevity that was appreciated by all. Frank kissed her in front of the assembled congregation of 41 people, and she kissed him back in the manner of a woman who had decided on a thing and intended to commit to it fully. The reception was held at Matilda's homestead, their homestead now, a fact that would take some getting used to on both sides, and Matilda had cooked 2 days in advance, and the table outside was covered in food despite the February cold, and the Dawson brothers played fiddle in a way that was enthusiastic if not technically accomplished, and Billy Cord danced with such determined energy that he knocked over 2 lanterns. It was not a grand affair. It was not supposed to be. It was the right size for what it was. They settled into the business of being married the way both of them settled into everything practically, with honesty, making adjustments as they went. There had been a real question of where they would live. His ranch was larger and better established. Her homestead held 8 years of her work, and her history with Robert and her mother's quilt on the wall. And they had talked about it over 3 evenings before arriving at a solution that neither of them would have predicted. They would winter at her homestead, which was smaller and easier to heat and keep. And come spring they would build properly on the ranch land. A real house rather than the bachelor quarters Frank had occupied for 6 years, incorporating into it anything from Matilda's homestead that she wanted moved. "The quilt goes wherever I go," she said on the first night of this arrangement, sitting across from him at the table that had been the site of more significant conversations than most tables ever witnessed. "Obviously," he said, "and Judge goes wherever I go. He is not ranch property, he is my horse, and if he and Copperhead don't get on, they'll get on," Frank said. "Copperhead gets on with everyone eventually. He just needs time." She looked at him with the ghost of a smile. "That sounds familiar." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "It does." The winter was the winter they had both separately spent 11 and 12 months, each preparing for cold and long and white and quiet. But it was a different winter for being shared. There were mornings when the cold was so sharp that the water in the kitchen basin had a skin of ice on it by dawn, and Frank would be up first and have the stove going before Matilda woke, and she would come out to a warm kitchen in her robe with her hair down, which was a version of her he was still sometimes astonished to have access to. There were evenings so still and dark that the silence outside was total, and they would sit reading by the lamp with the fire going and Judge and Copperhead both in the good barn Frank had helped make better, and it was the best kind of quiet, the kind that is full rather than empty. They argued, because they were both people with opinions that they held with conviction and expressed without apology. In March they had a considerable disagreement about the purchase of a bull for the future ranch operation. Frank wanted a specific breed he had researched, and Matilda had different ideas based on practical considerations of the local gray's quality, and the argument lasted 2 days and covered enough ground that it resolved into a third option neither of them had considered at the start, which Frank later acknowledged was probably the better choice. "You argued me into a better decision," he told her. "We argued each other into it," she said. "That's the point of 2 people thinking instead of 1. He looked at her with the particular expression he had that she had come to love, slightly exasperated, deeply admiring. "You're very hard to argue with. I prefer to think of it as being very easy to agree with once you've come to your senses," she said. Spring came the way spring comes to the Kansas plains, not gently but with the conviction of a force that has been waiting a long time and intends to make its point. The grass came up fast and vivid, greener than anything has a right to be after the gray months, and the sky opened up into a blue that seemed to have no ceiling, and the meadowlarks came back and made their announcement from every fence post on the property. True to the plan, they broke ground on the new house in April. Frank had drawn the plans himself over the winter, not a large house, but a proper one, with real wood frame construction and a proper kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a front porch facing west so they could watch the sunsets. Matilda reviewed the plans the first evening he showed them to her and made 12 specific comments, of which he incorporated 11, and she noted his acceptance of 11 out of 12, with a satisfaction she did not bother to disguise. Esteban brought his brother-in-law, a skilled carpenter named Jose who had come up from Texas and could make the wooden trim and window frames that Frank had been planning to leave plain, and Billy Cord turned out to have a genuine aptitude for laying foundations that he had never had occasion to discover before. Frank worked alongside them every day, and Matilda worked alongside them every day, and by the end of May there was a house on the Fletcher Ranch land that was better than anything any of them had built before. The day they moved Matilda's quilt into the new house and hung it on the wall of the room that was now their bedroom, Frank stood back and looked at it, the faded blues and greens of her mother's needlework, the repairs she had made herself where moths had gotten to it over the years, and said, "That belongs there." "Yes," Matilda said, standing beside him. "It does." The summer of 1879 was a working summer, as all their summers would be. They ran the horse operation together now, and Matilda's instincts with the animals proved as valuable to the business as Frank had predicted, and perhaps more so. She had an eye for young horses that were worth developing and an ability to evaluate temperament that saved them from 2 bad purchases and led them to one extraordinary one. A young gray stallion she spotted at a regional sale in July that Frank had not noticed, whose bloodlines were sound, and whose disposition was the kind that passes on to offspring. "How did you see that from 20 feet away?" Frank asked, watching the gray stallion moving in the sale ring with the contained energy of a very good horse. "He was the only one in the ring who was watching everything without flinching," Matilda said. "That's what you want, alert but not fearful." He bought the gray stallion at the price Matilda advised him was the ceiling, not $1 more, and the seller tried 3 times to push the price up, and each time Frank said, pleasantly and without moving, "My wife has set the number and she knows what she's talking about." And eventually the seller sold. On the ride home with the stallion on a lead behind the wagon, Billy Cord said to Esteban in an undertone that was not as private as he imagined, "He's the happiest I've ever seen him." Esteban nodded and said something in Spanish that Matilda, who had been improving considerably, translated in her head as roughly, "When people find what fits them, you can see it." She looked straight ahead at the road and said nothing, but she reached over and put her hand through Frank's arm, and he covered it with his without looking up from the horses. In August, Matilda told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning before breakfast. In the direct way she told him everything important, standing in the kitchen in the early light, flour on the table from the bread she had already started, her hands folded in front of her. "I think we are going to have a child," she said. "I am fairly certain. I will know more by the end of the month, but I believe so." He was completely still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands with a gentleness that he usually reserved for frightened horses, and he kissed her forehead and her cheek and then pulled her against him and held her. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am very well," she said, which was mostly true. She had been tired for 3 weeks, and the smell of the grain barrels made her stomach uncertain, but she was, in the important ways, very well. "Are you?" He pulled back and looked at her, and she saw in his face something she had not seen before, not joy exactly, or not only joy, but something larger and more fundamental, as if a door he had not known was locked had come open. "Yes," he said, "I am very well." She put her hand on his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him under his shirt. "Good," she said. "Now let me finish the bread." He laughed and she smiled, and the morning light came in through the west-facing window and lay across the kitchen floor in the particular gold of high summer. The pregnancy was not easy and not hard. It was the normal range of difficulty that a strong woman working a working ranch encounters when she is expecting her first child, which Matilda managed by adjusting her work rather than stopping it, and by making a deal with Frank that she would consult the doctor in Caldwell monthly, which she did, with the expression of a woman fulfilling a contractual obligation. Dr. Harmon, who had been Caldwell's physician for 15 years and had delivered children in circumstances ranging from comfortable to frankly alarming, told Frank privately in September that Matilda was in excellent health and excellent spirits, and that if he told her to rest she would rest when she decided to and not before, and that his best advice was to stop worrying. "She knows her own body better than most patients I see," the doctor said. "Trust her." Frank did trust her. He had learned, over the months of their marriage, that Matilda's self-knowledge was as precise as her knowledge of horses. She understood her own limits and her own capacities with a clarity that was not arrogance but simple accuracy. She knew when she needed help, and she was no longer too proud to say so, not in the categorical way she had been that October morning on the roof. She had not lost her pride, it was still the particular fiber of her character, the thing that made her stand straight and speak plain, but it had changed shape, become something less like a wall and more like a foundation. She said as much to him one evening in October, sitting on the front porch in the warm enough air of an early fall evening, watching the same kind of western sky that had been above them when he proposed. "I used to think asking for help was the same as admitting defeat," she said, "as if accepting anything from anyone proved that I couldn't manage on my own. And now," he said, "now I think I confused needing people with being weak, and those are not the same thing at all." She looked at the horizon. "You helped me see that, not by telling me, by showing me what it looked like to offer help that wasn't," she searched for the word, "condescending," he offered. "Conditional," she said. "Most of the help that was offered to me after Robert died came with conditions attached, the implication that accepting it meant I owed someone something beyond the practical, that I owed them my gratitude in a form that would diminish me." She paused. "You found a way to give me help that kept me whole. I just needed to find the door that was open," he said. "You taught me that the door existed." She turned and looked at him. "You called it a trade," she said. "Remember?" "I remember." "I knew it wasn't a trade," she said. "Not exactly, but the name you gave it allowed me to take what I needed without losing something I couldn't afford to lose at the time." "You called it something else," he said, which was what she had said to him in her repaired front room all those months ago. "And you let me." She smiled at him, not the small controlled smile she gave most occasions, but the full one that he had been accumulating all year as a private treasury, each instance distinct and precious. "I let you," she said, "because you were worth letting." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the failing light, and the horses moved in the paddock below, and the Kansas sky performed its nightly extravagance above them, and the child growing inside her was 3 months along and entirely real. Their son was born on the first day of March, 1880, in the house they had built with their own hands, with the doctor and a neighbor woman named Clara Briggs assisting, on a night when the last of winter's cold was trying its final argument against the coming spring. Frank paced the front room for 4 hours while the wind came and went outside, and the lamp in the bedroom burned steady behind the closed door, and when he heard the first cry, he stopped moving entirely and stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands and his eyes closed. "Doctor." Harmon opened the door and said, with the practiced calm of a man who had presided over this particular moment more times than he could count, "You have a son, Frank, and Matilda is fine." He went in. She was in the bed with her hair unbound and her face pale with exhaustion, and more beautiful to him in that moment than anything he had seen in 32 years of seeing things. The baby was in her arms, very new and very furious about it, with a furrowed expression that Frank immediately recognized as completely characteristic. "He has your frown," Frank said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "He has your disposition," she said, which coming from Matilda was not an insult. "Look at him. He's taking everything in." The baby had indeed stopped crying and was looking at the room with the unfocused but intense attention of someone cataloging a new situation. "What do we call him?" Frank said. They had discussed names through the fall and the winter without settling, both of them unwilling to commit before the child was present. Now he was present, and the name that came to Frank was there before he had assembled it consciously. "Henry," he said. "Henry James Fletcher." Matilda looked at the baby. "Henry," she said, trying it. The baby's expression did not change. "He doesn't object." "High praise," Frank said. She laughed, tired and quiet but real, and Frank sat beside them while the winter wind made its last argument outside, and the lamp burned, and Henry James Fletcher looked at the world with the focused alertness of a very good young horse, and everything that mattered was in that room. The months that followed Henry's arrival were full in the way that life with a new child and a working ranch is full, not always easy, not always restful, but rich with the particular texture of days that are consequential. Henry was a serious baby who became a serious infant, alert and watchful, slow to cry, interested in everything. He had Matilda's gray eyes and Frank's dark hair, and a stubbornness that appeared to be entirely his own achievement, developed presumably in the womb. Matilda had feared, with the dry honesty she applied to most fears, that motherhood might change the nature of her work, that she would be expected to retreat from the ranch operations to the domestic sphere in the way that most women in 1880 Kansas were expected to retire from anything active and purposeful the moment they became mothers. She said this to Frank directly. One evening when Henry was 6 weeks old and sleeping in the cradle Frank had made from good timber in November. "I will not become only this," she said, gesturing at the sleeping child with a gesture that was not unkind. "I love him. I will love him every day of my life, but I am other things, and those things don't stop being true." Frank looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I didn't marry a woman who would. I just wanted to say it out loud." "Say anything out loud you need to say," he said. "I'm listening." She nodded, satisfied, and they made the arrangements that they made. Clara Briggs, who had no children of her own and a genuine fondness for Henry, came 3 mornings a week to give Matilda proper time to work with the horses. On the other days, Henry came with her in the carrying cloth she had made, bundled against her chest, and observed the horses from this position with the interested focus that seemed to be his fundamental mode of engagement with everything. By the summer of 1880, the horse operation was producing enough that Frank and Matilda began to talk about expansion, not frantic growth, but the deliberate, honest building of something meant to last. They were selling horses as far as Wichita now, and Frank's reputation for quality had spread along the trading routes in the way that good reputations do, slowly and by word of actual experience rather than advertisement. Matilda's homestead, the original soddy where a roof had collapsed and everything had started, had been folded into the ranch, and she had made of it a proper stable facility for the younger horses still in training. The walls she had patched with her bare hands were still there, strengthened now, and she sometimes walked through them with Henry on her hip and felt the history of the place on her like a garment. Esteban had, by this point, been with them long enough that he was less employee and more family, and when he asked Frank in the spring of 1880 if he might bring his wife up from Texas, where she had been waiting for him to establish himself enough to send for her, Frank said yes before Esteban had finished asking. Rosa Ruiz arrived in July, a small, formidable woman with a quick laugh and an immediate friendship with Matilda that seemed to require no building period whatsoever, as if they had been waiting for each other. Billy Cord, for his part, had found a girl in Caldwell, a schoolteacher's daughter named Ada Prewitt, yes, Harold's youngest, and was conducting a courtship of such wholesome earnestness that the entire town found it charming. And Frank and Matilda attended the Pruitt Sunday dinner in September, where Billy announced his intentions with a speech that was fumbling and honest and completely winning. "You used to be like that," Matilda said to Frank on the ride home, with Henry asleep in her arms. "I was never quite that fumbling," Frank said. "No," she allowed. "You had a better approach." She paused. "You found the open door." He smiled, looking at the road ahead, the stars coming out over the flat, dark land. "You let me." "I did," she said. "Best decision I made that year." "Better than the gray stallion," she considered. "Comparable," she said, and he laughed, and Henry stirred in her arms and settled back, and the horse pulled the wagon steadily along the night road toward home. The years moved in the way of years that are well used, marked by seasons and work, and the small dramas of a community living close to the land, and therefore close to each other's business. The drought that came in 1881 hit the county hard, and Frank and Matilda made the decision to draw down their grain reserves to sell at fair price to two neighboring families who would not have made it through otherwise, which cost them the margin they had been building toward the planned addition to the house, but which Matilda said plainly was the only human thing to do, and Frank agreed. Injustice is when people who have help it and people who need it don't get it, not because there isn't enough but because no one moves, she said. In the kitchen on the morning they made the decision. "We can move, so we do." The Hendersons and the Cap family, who received the grain, had children that needed feeding, and the fact that the Fletchers could act made the difference between those families staying and leaving, which mattered to the county's future in ways that were real even if they were invisible. They got through the drought year lean but intact, and the following year, 1882, was a recovery year, and by harvest the ranch was back to the place it had been before the drought year's generosity, and both of them felt right about that sequence of events in the particular way that people feel right when they have acted in accordance with their own best judgment about what matters. In the fall of 1882, Matilda told Frank she was expecting again. Henry was 2.5 years old by then, walking everywhere with the determined gait of a child who has figured out bipedal motion and cannot see why anyone would operate any other way, and talking in complete sentences that were often disconcertingly accurate observations about the world around him. He had recently informed Esteban that Esteban's hat was too big for his face, and Esteban had agreed with complete seriousness that this was probably true. "Another one," Frank said, when Matilda told him, in the kitchen again in the morning light, the same way she had told him the first time. "Another one," she confirmed. "Your reaction seems measured." "I'm processing," he said. "Give me a moment." She raised her eyebrows. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands exactly as he had done 2 years before and kissed her forehead and her cheek, and she leaned her forehead against his chest. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Of the birth, no more than last time," she said. "Of the rest of it," she paused. "I believe we are capable of it." "I know we are," he said. Their daughter was born in April of 1883, in the same house, with the same doctor, and with Rosa Ruiz now present as an additional skilled and experienced hand, on a spring morning when the meadowlarks outside had been making their announcement since before dawn. She was smaller than Henry had been and quieter, and looked at the world from her first minutes with an expression that was not her father's focused attention or her mother's direct gray gaze, but something distinctly her own, a kind of considering quality, as if she were reserving judgment until she had sufficient evidence. "What do we call her?" Frank asked. Matilda looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Ruth," she said. Ruth Clara Fletcher, Clara for Clara Briggs, who had made so many mornings possible. Frank agreed immediately. Henry met his sister with the solemn gravity of a 2-year-old confronting a major change in his understanding of the household. He stood at the bedside and looked at Ruth for a long time and then said, "She's small." "She is," Matilda said. "She'll get bigger." "Like the gray colt got bigger?" Henry asked. He had been following the gray stallion's first offspring through its early months with devoted attention. Just like that, Frank said. Henry considered this. All right, he said, and turned to examine the room for other things of interest, apparently satisfied. The years that followed were the good years, the solid years that a person looks back on from later life and recognizes as the time when the life they had been building was fully built and fully lived. Frank and Matilda Fletcher ran one of the better horse operations in Sumner County, known for quality and for fair dealing, and Matilda's work with difficult animals had become something of a local legend. People brought horses to her from neighboring counties, horses that other trainers had given up on, and she would spend time with them in the paddock in that unhurried sideways way, and most of them came right eventually. Henry grew up on the back of a horse, and with his mother's directness and his father's patience, a combination that made him unusually effective at 11, 12, 13 years old in a way that other children's parents noticed and occasionally mentioned, with a mixture of admiration and mild complaint. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's jaw, and a laugh that belonged to neither of them but was entirely generous. Ruth grew into her considering quality. She was a child who read everything she could find and asked questions that required her parents to think before answering, and who at age 6 correctly identified a problem with the irrigation system Frank was planning for the South Field, which Frank spent an afternoon reviewing before acknowledging she was right. She has your brain, he told Matilda. She has her own brain, Matilda said. Stop attributing children to their parents. They're themselves. He smiled the smile he had been accumulating for years. You're right. I usually am, she said, and there was the ghost of that early sharpness in her voice, but it was warm now, completely warm, the way an edge can be beloved when it belongs to someone you love entirely. They were standing on the front porch in the evening, the one that faced west, and the sunset was doing its extravagant best across the Kansas sky, orange and red, and the deep purple along the horizon that Frank had first seen the night he asked her to marry him, and that he had watched with her every evening since they had lived in this house and had never gotten used to, which seemed right. Ruth was inside reading something by lamplight. Henry was in the barn giving Sable, now an older mare, gray around the muzzle, still the most willing horse on the property, her evening grain, talking to her in the low, quiet voice he had learned from his mother. Esteban and Rosa were in their house across the yard, their own 2 children asleep by now. Billy Cord had married Ada Prewitt in 1881 and lived in town, but came out 4 days a week still, and was planning to buy his own small parcel the following year, which Frank was already quietly ensuring would go well. The quilt hung on the bedroom wall behind them, faded now and repaired several more times, the blues and greens of Matilda's mother's needlework as present, and as meaningful as when it had first been tucked against a repaired wall in a sod house that no longer stood. Do you remember, Frank said, watching the sunset, what you said to me the first time I stopped at your gate? I told you I appreciated the observation and had not asked for one, she said. You did, he said. And I thought there's a person who knows exactly who they are. She was quiet for a moment. I thought, she said, there's a man who is going to be a problem. He turned and looked at her. A problem. The good kind, she said. The kind you don't solve. The kind you keep. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, as she had been letting him in 1,000 ways for 6 years now. Not because she needed him to hold it, but because she wanted to, which had always been the entire difference. The sky went deeper and the stars began to appear. First one, and then many, and then the full vast count of them above the flat country, where a roof had once fallen in, and a proud woman had stood in the wreckage with her hands on her hips and her jaw set, and where a man on a dark bay horse had stopped at a gate and found, in the specific architecture of her refusal, the one door that was open. He had called it something else and she had let him, and what it had been all along was the beginning of everything. Ruth came to the porch door and said, from behind the screen, Mama, I have a question about something I read. Of course you do, Matilda said. Come out here and ask it in the good light. Ruth came out with her book and sat on the porch step at their feet. A girl of 7 with her mother's gray eyes and her grandmother's quilt on the wall inside and a question about the world. And the meadowlarks somewhere out in the dark grass were still making their announcement. And Frank Fletcher held his wife's hand in the evening cool and watched the last of the light go out of the western sky. And the life they had built together from a collapsed roof, and a fair trade, and a name for things that let both of them keep what they needed to keep was whole and good and entirely, completely their own. It was the autumn of 1885, and the wind that swept across the prairie was the particular kind of October wind that Matilda Finley Fletcher had come to love. The kind that had cruelty in it but beauty too, the kind that stripped away what was weak and left what was solid standing. Everything standing on their land was solid. She had made sure of that herself.